His heart stopped as the shock of recognition struck him. The boots belonged to Susan. But what had happened? Why had she been left there? Why wasn't she in her car? Why were there no answers, just more questions? Evan's hands trembled as he reached for his phone. He quickly called 911, his voice breaking as he reported what he had found. "I found her. She's dead." A quiet morning in Oregon, where the forest's towering pines and rugged trails breathe serenity. But for 61-year-old Susan Lane-Fournier, it was the beginning of a chilling mystery. On November 22, 2023, Susan, a beloved member of her community, was reported missing. Her absence from work was the first alarm, but no one could have imagined how much darker things would become. Susan's disappearance triggered a sense of unease that gripped those who knew her. She wasn't just a woman with a smile that lit up any room she entered. She was a sister, a daughter, a friend, and a wife. To those closest to her, the silence was deafening. What had happened to Susan? Where was she? And more importantly, who was responsible for her vanishing? It wasn't long before authorities began to piece together the early stages of a tragedy. The sheriff's office immediately launched a search. The missing persons report seemed straightforward, but soon, small details began to stir questions. Susan's estranged husband, Michael Fournier, seemed far too quiet. Though he was known to frequent the town's local spots, he hadn't been seen near the places they would typically find him. But it wasn't until the discovery of her car that the true nature of this case began to unravel. A white 1992 Ford F-250, left abandoned near a trailhead at Mount Hood, told a story of its own. The car was almost a grave marker, a beacon for what lay ahead. As the search intensified, Susan's friend, James Evans, found himself drawn into a search that would change his life forever. Evans was determined to find his friend in the dense, wet woods around Mount Hood, if not to bring her home, then to at least bring some closure. Little did he know, this was only the beginning of a dark and twisted tale. The path was winding, and muddy from recent rain. Evans followed the trail, scanning every step. As he trudged forward, something caught his eye, a tarp, partially hidden under some branches. It seemed misplaced in the wild expanse of the forest. At first, he thought it might have been discarded trash, but when he leaned it down to investigate, a pair of boots appeared beneath the tarp. His heart stopped as the shock of recognition struck him. The boots belonged to Susan. But what had happened? Why had she been left there? Why wasn't she in her car? Why were there no answers, just more questions? As we come to the end of this chapter, we can't help but wonder, how would you cope with such a tragedy? How would you find the strength to continue after such a painful loss? It's a question that lingers, one that many of the people who knew Brandy will be grappling with for months if not years. Evan's hands trembled as he reached for his phone. He quickly called 911, his voice breaking as he reported what he had found. "I found her. She's dead." The authorities arrived soon after. The scene that greeted them was nothing short of heartbreaking. Susan's body was lifeless, her spirit extinguished far too soon. But one question haunted everyone in the vicinity: who had done this? Who had murdered Susan Lane-Fournier? Was it a random act, or was it someone who knew her intimately? You've just stepped into a whirlwind of heartbreak and mystery. A life torn apart, a husband's dark secrets, and the crushing weight of loss. But what happened to Susan Lane-Fournier? How did this turn from a missing person case to a tragedy so shocking, it left an entire community in disbelief? We'll uncover the twisted details as the story unfolds, and trust me, you won't want to miss a single moment of it. But before we continue, I have a question for you. Where are you watching from right now? Let us know in the comments below, I'd love to hear from you. And if this story has even the slightest tug on your heart, hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and don't forget to subscribe. This is just the beginning, and we have so much more to uncover in the next chapter. As the investigation began to unfold, the authorities soon learned that Susan's marriage had been far from perfect. On paper, Michael Fournier, 71, seemed like an ordinary man, a man who loved his wife, but a deeper look at their relationship revealed a darker story. Susan had been married to Michael for decades, but over time, the cracks in their marriage grew larger and harder to ignore. The couple had been estranged for some time before her death, but that didn't mean Michael was free from suspicion. His name immediately came up when the police started their investigation. He was the one closest to her, and now, he was the one they needed to focus on. Michael Fournier's demeanor during the investigation was cold, almost distant. He didn't seem overly concerned about his missing wife. His alibi was shaky at best. And as time passed, the police dug deeper into their troubled marriage, uncovering a history of conflict, unresolved tension, and emotional distress. They discovered that Susan had recently made plans to finalize her separation from Michael. Her friends confirmed that she had been speaking more openly about ending things once and for all. She had found a new sense of independence. But something had always seemed to hold her back. What was it? Was it Michael's influence or his control over her? Or was there something more sinister at play? The search for answers only deepened as they learned more about Michael's actions in the days leading up to Susan's disappearance. His whereabouts were initially unclear. Did he play a role in her death? The timeline of events didn't add up. The investigators knew they had to work quickly before the trail went cold. One of the key pieces of evidence emerged when they found Michael's vehicle near the scene. His truck had been spotted in the area on the night Susan went missing. It was a quiet, almost unassuming detail, but to the detectives, it was enough to raise suspicion. The trail was starting to point in his direction. But as the investigation expanded, another shocking discovery would add a new layer of mystery to the case. Authorities would soon uncover a disturbing truth about what had happened to Susan's dogs. They had gone missing along with her, but no one had connected the dots. Where were they? And what had happened to them? The days after Susan's discovery were filled with grief and confusion, but there was a pressing question that no one could shake. How had Susan ended up in the woods, abandoned and lifeless, just yards from her car? And why was Michael Fournier so silent, so seemingly unfazed? As authorities delved deeper into the investigation, they uncovered troubling clues hidden within the wilderness, fragments of the truth that had been buried beneath the canopy of trees. The investigation took a darker turn when Susan's two missing dogs were found dead nearby, their bodies lifeless and discarded like forgotten possessions. The dogs were a crucial part of her life, and their deaths were an undeniable clue that something more terrible was unfolding. The dogs' bodies were found in a location that wasn't far from where Susan's body had been discovered. The location was isolated, and in the absence of any visible witnesses, it was clear that someone had deliberately placed them there. But who? And why? The connection between the death of the dogs and the circumstances surrounding Susan's death was unclear, but there was no doubt that it played a significant role in the case. Was Michael responsible for the deaths of the dogs? Was this part of a larger plan, or was it simply an act of cruelty? In the midst of the investigation, the focus remained on Michael Fournier. But authorities soon realized that they were up against more than just a grieving husband. Michael's past, filled with unresolved issues and emotional instability, only added more questions to the growing pile. He was the key, and yet, there was still so much they didn't understand. At this point in the case, no one was certain what would happen next. Would Michael Fournier be charged? Would the truth come to light? Or was there something else, something far more troubling, lurking beneath the surface? As the investigation continued, the mystery only deepened. The hours stretched on, and the investigation into Susan's tragic death was far from over. But in the quiet moments, when all the investigators could do was wait for answers, one thing became painfully clear: Michael Fournier was not showing the kind of remorse they expected from someone in his situation. The police had spoken with Michael multiple times, but each interview revealed more and more inconsistencies. Michael's story kept changing. First, he claimed he hadn't seen Susan for days before her disappearance. Then, he said he had no idea where she could have gone. But the contradictions began to pile up. Why would a man be so aloof in the face of such a loss? Was this truly grief, or was it something more calculated? The investigators continued to dig into his background, searching for answers that might explain his behavior. His coldness was unsettling. Michael's silence spoke volumes, and in the chilling atmosphere of the investigation room, his refusal to engage only deepened the mystery surrounding his involvement. Could he truly be innocent, or was this just a man hiding behind his guilt? Each new detail only raised more questions. Did Michael kill his wife? Did he have something to hide? Or was he telling the truth? And if he wasn't responsible for her death, then who was? The search for answers continued, but it was clear that every discovery added layers of complexity to the case. As investigators dug deeper into Michael Fournier's background, they uncovered even more unsettling truths about his actions in the days leading up to Susan's disappearance. It was as though every turn they took only raised more questions. The peaceful town near Mount Hood, known for its quiet charm and breathtaking views, had become a backdrop for something far darker, a scene no one could have predicted. For those who had known Susan, the search for her had always been a mission of love. Her friend, James Evans, couldn't shake the image of the body he had discovered in the woods. As he stood before the police, recounting the moment he found Susan's lifeless body, the words barely seemed to come out. His voice trembled with emotion, the weight of his grief evident in his eyes. Evans was not only shocked by the death of his friend but horrified by the circumstances. It was as if the forest had swallowed her whole, hiding her away until Evans had no choice but to confront the horror. "It's not something you expect to find," Evans had said, his voice still raw. "I knew I had to find her. But not like this. Not dead. Not so far from home." The investigation team worked tirelessly, but what Evans didn't know at the time was how critical his discovery would become. The moment he reported his finding to the authorities, the search shifted gears. What had seemed like a missing persons case now appeared to be something much more sinister: murder. Michael Fournier, the estranged husband, had been at the center of this nightmare since the beginning. But it wasn't until the police focused on the timeline of his movements that they began to connect the dots. They found traces of his presence at various locations, all leading to one conclusion: Michael had likely been close to the trailhead around the time Susan had vanished. Forensic evidence was now at the forefront of the investigation. Detectives worked with precision to piece together the timeline from the moment Susan was last seen to the chilling discovery of her body. The authorities also interviewed people who knew Susan and Michael, trying to understand the dynamics of their relationship. But it wasn't just Michael's actions that raised questions, it was the circumstances surrounding the discovery of Susan's dogs. Both animals had gone missing with her, but they weren't found with her body. They were found elsewhere in the woods, and their deaths seemed deliberate. The idea that someone would go as far as to kill two innocent dogs as part of a larger plan didn't sit well with anyone involved in the case. How were the dogs linked to Susan's death? Was their fate intertwined with hers? As the investigators examined the area, they found traces of dog fur and signs that the animals had struggled. They had been left behind in the woods to perish. In a strange way, this detail was just as horrifying as Susan's death. It was the kind of cruelty that left a stain on the community. In the aftermath of these discoveries, the case quickly gained media attention. News outlets reported the events in tragic detail, but they didn't reveal everything. What they didn't know, what no one had anticipated, was that the answers the investigators were desperately seeking were hidden in plain sight. Michael Fournier's past, a history of escalating violence, a pattern of control, and chilling indifference, had shaped the tragedy in ways no one could have foreseen. As the investigation into Susan's death deepened, the police uncovered shocking details about Michael Fournier's past, revealing a pattern of controlling and troubling behavior that left everyone involved in the case stunned. The man who had once been Susan's partner, the man who had promised to love and protect her, had a much darker side, one that now seemed impossible to ignore. Those close to Susan painted a picture of a woman who had long suffered in silence. While she outwardly appeared strong, Many who knew her were unaware of the emotional toll her marriage had taken on her. Susan had always been fiercely independent, but she had endured years of control and manipulation behind closed doors. Michael had a way of keeping her tethered, making it difficult for her to escape the confines of their relationship. Over the years, Susan had tried to make the best of her marriage, often convincing herself that the turbulence was just a phase. But there were moments, dark moments, when Susan had confided in close friends about the emotional weight she carried. Friends described her as conflicted, torn between her desire for freedom and the pull of her long-standing relationship with Michael. Michael had a history of aggressive behavior. Susan was not the first to report his volatility. Over the years, several people have witnessed his outbursts, his controlling nature, and his ability to manipulate those around him. At first, they dismissed it as a result of stress or a rough patch. But with each passing year, the behavior grew worse, more erratic. Now, with Susan's tragic death, the investigators were forced to confront this darker side of Michael Fournier. They learned that he had been a man with a temperament that could shift at a moment's notice. Those close to him could attest to his domineering personality. In fact, they began to wonder if Susan had ever truly been able to escape his control, even after their separation. But even with this newfound understanding of Michael's behavior, there was still one piece of the puzzle that eluded the investigators: motive. Why would Michael murder his wife? What had happened in the days leading up to Susan's disappearance that would cause him to cross that line? Authorities were still piecing together the timeline. Michael's whereabouts, his statements, and his actions were now under intense scrutiny. Was this a crime of passion, or was it something premeditated? Was Michael simply unable to let go, or did he see Susan's newfound independence as a threat to his control? As the investigation continued, a chilling question loomed over everyone involved: was this a tragic end to a fractured relationship, or was there something more dangerous at play, something far darker that the public had yet to uncover? The search for truth intensified as detectives uncovered more pieces of evidence, each one pointing toward the same unsettling conclusion. Michael Fournier's silence had now become deafening. The more they learned, the clearer it became: the evidence was stacking up against him. The sheriff's office had carefully collected and analyzed every detail of Susan's car, her body, and the surrounding area. What they found painted a grim picture, one that suggested Susan had been lured into the woods, perhaps under the guise of a reunion. The area near the trailhead where her car had been parked was remote and isolated, a perfect place for someone to disappear. But it wasn't just the location that raised suspicions. The path Susan had taken, her final moments, was beginning to piece together in ways that made Michael Fournier's involvement seem all but certain. It was becoming clear that Michael had been there, present in the woods, near the time of Susan's death. The investigators had now gathered enough circumstantial evidence to pursue their theories further. But it wasn't until they turned their attention back to Michael's behavior that they began to see a clearer picture. Michael's strange detachment, his coldness in the face of his wife's death, now made sense. His statements, filled with contradictions, were no longer just odd, they were signs of a man trying to cover his tracks. And then, as if on cue, a breakthrough arrived. Surveillance footage from a nearby gas station had captured Michael's truck near the area the night Susan had gone missing. He had been there, within striking distance of where Susan had parked her car. The evidence, though circumstantial, was damning. What had Michael been doing there? What had he planned? The case was rapidly approaching its tipping point, and soon, it would be Michael Fournier's turn to answer the tough questions. It's said that the truth has a way of revealing itself, even when the walls of silence seem impenetrable. But in Michael Fournier's case, the truth didn't come with the shock of a confession. No, the truth was a slow burn, creeping through the cracks of his statements, his actions, and the undeniable evidence that had been accumulating over time. It wasn't a loud admission of guilt but a subtle shift, one that seemed to echo louder than any spoken words. Michael's demeanor had shifted. In the days following Susan's discovery, he was not the distraught husband the investigators had expected. He was calm, unnervingly so. He didn't display the raw, chaotic grief of a man who had lost his wife. Instead, he wore an air of indifference, a coldness that chilled even those who were familiar with him. It wasn't long before the authorities began questioning his behavior in the aftermath of Susan's death. This lack of emotion had not gone unnoticed. Michael's friends, family, and even the investigators noted it. When someone dies, especially a spouse, the world expects an eruption of emotion, a primal reaction that demonstrates the gravity of the loss. But Michael Fournier, it seemed, was more focused on maintaining a sense of control over his environment than on grappling with his wife's tragic end. The investigators knew they needed more than just his detached demeanor. They needed something concrete, something undeniable. And soon, they would get it. It was a small, seemingly insignificant detail that turned out to be a game-changer in the case. A phone call. The authorities had been meticulously reviewing the phone records and messages from Susan and Michael's phones. After hours of painstaking analysis, one particular exchange stood out. It was a series of text messages between Michael and Susan that had been sent shortly before her disappearance. On the surface, the messages appeared typical, a few lines of banal conversation, mostly about plans for the weekend, and one or two mentions of things to do around the house. But when examined closely, there was something darker hidden beneath their surface, a subtle pressure. Michael's messages had started innocuously enough, asking about Susan's plans, where she would be, and what she intended to do over the coming days. But then they began to shift. They became more insistent. Michael questioned Susan's choices, asking her to stay closer to home, to not venture too far out, and even suggested she cancel certain plans. The final exchange was perhaps the most telling. Michael texted, "You'll be safe if you listen to me. I just want to make sure you are okay." It was a chilling glimpse into Michael's mindset, an unsettling glimpse into how he had tried to manipulate his estranged wife's choices, even after their separation. These texts weren't just messages from a concerned husband, they were the words of someone who wanted control, someone unwilling to let go, even after the marriage had unraveled. In the wake of this discovery, the investigators' suspicions grew stronger. It was clear that Michael had been trying to keep Susan within his reach, even in the days leading up to her death. The police could now build a clearer picture of the control he had exerted over her, and they knew they were getting closer to the truth. Then came the breakthrough. It wasn't just Michael's words that betrayed him, it was his actions. As the investigation team continued to piece together the timeline, they found an undeniable link between Michael's behavior and the time of Susan's death. The breakthrough came when they discovered footage from a local surveillance camera. The camera, positioned near a gas station on a quiet rural road, had caught Michael's truck passing by on the night Susan had gone missing. But this wasn't just any routine drive. The footage showed Michael slowing down, almost as though he was carefully watching for something, or perhaps someone. It was around the same time Susan's car had been reported near the trailhead. This piece of footage was crucial. It placed Michael at the scene of the crime, not as a concerned husband searching for his wife, but as a man who knew exactly where she was. This discovery was a game changer. The investigators now had both motive and opportunity. The pieces of the puzzle that had seemed scattered and elusive were beginning to align, and Michael's role in his wife's death was becoming clearer with each passing moment. But the real question now loomed larger than ever: what had Michael done to Susan? What led him to take her life in the cold, isolated wilderness near Mount Hood? As the days passed, the weight of the investigation grew heavier. Michael had not yet been formally charged with murder, but the evidence against him had mounted to an undeniable crescendo. The texts, the footage, the history of emotional manipulation, all of it pointed to one conclusion: Michael Fournier had not only been involved in his wife's death, he had orchestrated it. In the hours leading up to Susan's tragic end, Michael had likely lured her into the woods with promises of reconciliation, only to turn on her once she was vulnerable. Was it a crime of passion? Or had Michael been planning this for longer than anyone could have imagined? One crucial question remained unanswered: what had happened between Michael and Susan in those final moments? The authorities believed they were close to a confession, but Michael remained tight-lipped, refusing to reveal the details of that night. His cold silence spoke volumes, and with every passing hour, the investigators grew more certain of his guilt. In the interim, Michael's estranged daughter spoke out. She was devastated by the loss of her mother, but what struck a chord with everyone was her unwavering belief in her father's guilt. "I knew he was capable of terrible things," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "But I never thought he'd go this far. He never let go of her. And now she's gone." Her words cut deep, and they echoed the sentiments of so many who had known Michael and Susan. The tragedy of it all was not just the death of an innocent woman, but the fact that it had been orchestrated by someone who should have protected her, the man she had once loved. As the investigation closed in on Michael, the community around Mount Hood was left grappling with the reality of what had happened. The quiet, peaceful life they had once known had been shattered by a senseless act of violence, and no one could truly understand how something like this could unfold in their midst. But in the end, the chilling truth was undeniable: Michael Fournier had murdered his wife, Susan Lane-Fournier. His need for control, his obsessive behavior, and his emotional manipulation had pushed him to the breaking point. And in the quiet woods near Mount Hood, Susan's life had ended. As the authorities prepared to arrest Michael, one question remained: what would drive a man to commit such a horrific act? What would drive him to murder the person he had once called his own? After days of tension, heartbreak, and mounting evidence, the investigators were ready to confront Michael Fournier with the truth they had painstakingly uncovered. The pieces of the puzzle had come together, and each piece added a weight that became impossible for anyone to ignore. The walls were closing in on Michael, and he knew it. The quiet, steady pressure from the detectives had been unrelenting. But it wasn't just the evidence that had trapped him, it was the overwhelming sense of betrayal he must have felt when he realized the depth of his actions. A sense of loss that went beyond the death of his wife. Michael sat in the interrogation room, staring blankly at the floor. He had been in here for hours, but there was no sign of the anguish that should have been seeping out of him, the distress that should have manifested as he came to terms with the crime he had committed. Instead, his eyes were hollow, his hands trembling only slightly, as though he were trying to resist something. His silence, though, spoke volumes. In some ways, it was more damning than any confession could have been. The detectives who had worked tirelessly on the case entered the room. There was no need for theatrics, no need for flashing lights, or loud accusations. The atmosphere in that room had already shifted. They had the evidence. They had his words, his actions, and the unmistakable connection to Susan's death. The time for games was over. One of the detectives, a seasoned investigator named Jennifer Shaw, sat down across from Michael. She looked at him for a long moment, her gaze steady and unwavering. "Michael," she began quietly, "we know what happened. We know what you did." The words hit Michael like a wave. For a moment, he seemed to freeze, his mind racing, perhaps trying to figure out how much he had left to lose. But then he exhaled slowly, as if resigning himself to a fate that had been inevitable all along. Michael's lips parted, but no words came out. The room hung in a heavy silence. Detective Shaw leaned forward, her voice still calm but tinged with resolve. "You know this isn't going away, don't you? The more you hide, the worse it will be. You're not going to walk out of here. Not after what you've done to Susan." Michael swallowed hard, his throat dry. His hands gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. Finally, he looked up at Shaw, his eyes meeting hers. "I loved her," he muttered, almost inaudibly, as though he were trying to convince himself more than anyone else. "I loved Susan. I never wanted any of this to happen." Shaw didn't flinch at his words. "Then why did you do it, Michael? Why did you kill her?" Michael turned his gaze to the floor again, avoiding her eyes. It was a question he had clearly been dreading. A question that cut straight to the heart of the violence he had committed. A question that demanded an answer, one that no words could ever truly explain. "I didn't mean to," he finally whispered, his voice cracking under the strain. She was. She was going to leave me. She was going to leave me for good. And I couldn't. He stopped mid-sentence, his words faltering. The room grew even quieter. Detective Shaw let the silence stretch, her eyes never leaving Michael's face. She understood now, the desperation, the suffocating need for control. Michael wasn't just confessing to murder, he was confessing to a loss of self-control, a loss of everything he thought he could hold on to. I just wanted her to stay, he said, his voice breaking. I couldn't let her go. I couldn't stand the thought of her being with someone else. I wasn't going to let her walk away from me, not after everything we had been through. Shaw nodded slowly, her expression softened but still resolute. So you thought killing her would stop that? That it would make her stay? Michael's face contorted in an expression of frustration, guilt, and something darker. I didn't think. I just wanted her to be mine again. Forever. I never meant for it to go so far. I lost control. The detectives had known, of course. They had heard versions of this story countless times. The story of a man who couldn't bear to lose what he felt he deserved. But there was something different about Michael's confession. It wasn't a sudden outburst, a burst of anger, or some cold calculation, it was something more insidious. It was the quiet unraveling of a man who had held on to his obsessions for too long until they consumed him completely. As Shaw sat across from him, listening to his words, she thought about Susan, the woman whose life had been taken. She thought about the small details of Susan's life, the fact that she had been independent, strong-willed, and dedicated to her family. A woman who, despite the end of her marriage, had been carving out a life for herself, a life that Michael could never accept. Susan's friends had described her as compassionate and caring, always looking out for those she loved. It was clear she had wanted to escape from a marriage that had suffocated her. Michael, it seemed, couldn't understand that. For him, Susan's desire to be free wasn't a sign of strength, it was a betrayal. Michael's confession brought no sense of catharsis. There were no tears, no apologies, just the mechanical telling of events that had led to Susan's tragic death. In the sterile, dimly lit room, with the weight of his actions hanging in the air, Michael Fournier's remorse seemed almost performative. As if he were trying to convince himself of his own sorrow. But Detective Shaw wasn't fooled. You killed her, Michael, she said firmly, because you couldn't accept that she was leaving. You couldn't accept that she was moving on. But you don't get to decide when someone's life ends. No one does. Michael nodded, almost imperceptibly, as if he was hearing these words for the first time. I know, he whispered. The next moments were a blur for Michael, a chaotic mix of confusion, guilt, and disbelief. He had confessed, but the finality of it hadn't quite hit him yet. The room grew colder as Shaw stood up, signaling the end of their conversation. There was nothing more to say. But as she left the room, she turned back to face him one last time. You can still change the story, Michael. You can still tell the truth about that night. But only if you're ready to face what you've done. Michael's face remained expressionless. But as Shaw exited, one last thought seemed to linger in the silence, a question that, despite his confession, would continue to haunt him. What kind of man had he become? The courtroom was a solemn theater, its walls thick with the weight of unspeakable truths. The faint creak of wooden benches echoed as the crowd shifted nervously. Family members, friends, and curious onlookers had packed the room, their faces reflecting a mix of anguish and determination. Everyone had come for one thing, justice for Susan Lane-Fournier. Michael Fournier, now clad in an orange jumpsuit, sat at the defense table. His face was drawn, his shoulders hunched, a stark contrast to the imposing figure he had once been. Beside him, his defense attorney shuffled through a stack of papers, their expression betraying a quiet resignation. They had fought hard to control the narrative, but the evidence against Michael was damning. The prosecutor, a seasoned litigator named Clara Yates, rose with calm authority as the judge signaled for opening statements to begin. Clara was known for her relentless pursuit of justice, particularly in cases involving domestic violence. Her gaze swept over the jury, making brief but piercing eye contact with each member. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice steady and deliberate, "this is not a case about misunderstanding or miscommunication. This is a case about control, about obsession, and about the tragic loss of a vibrant life that should still be with us today." Clara recounted Susan's final days, painting a vivid picture of a woman who had been attempting to reclaim her independence. She spoke of Susan's warm personality, her love for her dogs, and her dedication to her work. "Susan Lane-Fournier was more than a victim," Clara said firmly. "She was a mother, a friend, and a beacon of strength to those around her. Her life was stolen in an act of cruelty that cannot be ignored." The prosecution's case was methodical, each piece of evidence carefully introduced to build an unassailable narrative. They began with the timeline of Susan's disappearance, her failure to show up for work, the discovery of her car near the mounted trailhead, and the chilling moment when her body was found by her friend, James Evans. "Imagine the horror," Clara said, her voice lowering as she addressed the jury. "A loyal friend, determined to bring Susan home, discovers her lifeless body beneath a tarp. And what did he see first? A pair of boots, a haunting detail that tells you everything you need to know about the respect Susan's killer had for her." The courtroom was silent, the air thick with tension. Clara then shifted to the autopsy findings, describing the medical examiner's conclusion that Susan had died from a violent act of homicide. Bruising patterns, evidence of blunt force trauma, and the absence of defensive wounds suggested she had been caught off guard, likely attacked by someone she trusted. But it was the testimony of Susan's friend, James Evans, that proved to be the emotional turning point of the trial. James took the stand, his voice trembling as he described the search that had led him to Susan's body. "I told myself I'd find her," he said, pausing to steady his voice. "But not like that. Not like that." James recounted the moment he bent to pick up what he thought was trash, a tarp, and saw the boots that led him to Susan. His words were raw, his pain palpable. "She was my friend," he said, tears streaming down his face. "She deserved better. She deserved to live." Michael sat motionless during James's testimony, his face an unreadable mask. But the jury couldn't ignore the stark contrast between the anguish of Susan's loved ones and Michael's detached demeanor. The prosecution's strongest blow came when they revealed digital evidence tying Michael to the scene. Cell phone records placed him near the trailhead around the time of Susan's disappearance. Surveillance footage from a gas station showed him purchasing duct tape and a tarp just hours before her body was discovered. The damning nature of these details left the defense scrambling to regain control. Michael's defense attorney, desperate to sow doubt in the jury's mind, painted a picture of a man overwhelmed by heartbreak. They argued that Michael's actions, while troubling, were not premeditated. They suggested that Susan's death could have been the result of an accident, an argument that fell flat in the face of overwhelming evidence. The defense also attempted to portray Michael as a man who had been pushed to his breaking point. "My client loved his wife," the attorney insisted, their tone pleading. "He made mistakes, yes, but love can drive us to places we never imagined we'd go." But the jury remained unmoved. The prosecution countered with the chilling reality of domestic violence, the patterns of control, the escalation of anger, and the devastating consequences when someone decides they cannot let go. The trial reached its climax when Michael himself took the stand. It was a calculated risk by the defense, one that could either humanize him or seal his fate. As he began to speak, his voice cracked with what some interpreted as genuine remorse. "I never wanted this," Michael said, his eyes fixed on the floor. "I loved Susan. I just wanted her to come back to me." But under cross-examination, Clara Yates exposed the inconsistencies in his story. She pressed him on the timeline, on the purchases he had made, and on the injuries Susan had sustained. Michael's answers grew more evasive, his calm unraveling as Clara dismantled his narrative piece by piece. "Mr. Fournier," Clara said, her voice sharp, "if you loved Susan, why didn't you let her go? Why did you feel the need to control her, to silence her forever? Michael had no answer. The courtroom hung in a heavy silence, the weight of his guilt palpable to everyone present. As the trial drew to a close, the jury was left with the task of determining Michael's fate. The judge's instructions were clear, but the emotional weight of the case was impossible to ignore. For Susan's family and friends, the verdict represented more than justice. It was a chance to reclaim her story, to ensure her life would not be defined by the man who took it. When the jury returned with their decision, the tension in the courtroom was unbearable. The foreperson stood, their voice steady as they delivered the verdict, guilty of second-degree murder. A collective gasp rippled through the room, followed by tears of relief and quiet sobs. Michael Fournier sat in stunned silence as the reality of his actions finally caught up with him. The judge handed down a lengthy sentence, ensuring he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. For Susan's loved ones, the verdict was a bittersweet victory. It couldn't bring her back, but it provided a measure of closure. As they left the courtroom, they held on to the memory of a woman whose light had touched so many lives, a light that, despite the darkness of her final days, would never be extinguished. The verdict is in. Justice, in some form, has been served. But the scars remain. The grief is everlasting. Susan Lane-Fournier's life ended too soon. Her story, one of love, loss, and betrayal, will stay with us forever. But now, we want to hear from you. What do you think of this case? Do you believe justice was truly served? How does this story make you feel? Drop your thoughts in the comments, your voice matters. And if you haven't already, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss any more heartbreaking real-life stories like this one. The truth has been uncovered, but there's still so much more to discuss. So, if you want to be a part of these powerful conversations and help share Susan's story, hit that subscribe button now. Let's keep the conversation going. Thank you for watching. Until next time.